Hey guys, Dimitri here with another Freecad tutorial. In this one we're going to start exploring more advanced options, and by the end of it we should be able to build something fairly simple but the rate on floors and fully adjustable and parametric. By that I mean is if we change one component or one element rather, let's change this to 12 meters and update. We should see everything updating. Okay, so let's get started by going through how this was created. So before we do that, I'm actually going to start with this smaller, simpler project here, which is a rectangle. So everything in Freecad, well not everything, but most things, they can be based on sketches. Now sketches have offered tremendous advantages because they can be constrained parametrically. So this is a simple rectangle with two constraints, 2 meters and 3 meters, and if I double click on them, I see that they have a name called length. So if we exit out, we see those constraints when the element is selected, and if I change them outside, then the element adjusts. So let's see how we can create one. I'm going to hide this. I will go to Sketcher. Without anything selected, that's important. Select this button here, create new sketch. And we'll create it on the XY plane. Now if you see the work plane, if in BIM, it's set to auto. But if you click on that button where it says auto, we can set it to XY top. So now it looks more like we expected. Okay, so now if I go back to Sketcher, reset my view to top view, we'll draw a rectangle. Let's make it about this big. Great, so now I have a rectangle. And you see everything is kind of connected. So all of these are constraints. These little elements here, that's a horizontal constraint. Little constraints to make sure that these lines are together. And we can see all of that in tasks. For the element, I think I need to exit and enter. Let's try again. There you go. I think when I switched workbenches, the UI got confused. So here we have a list of all the constraints. So the little dots means that they're coincident constraints. That means that the vertex of this line and the vertex of that line, they stay together. And then we have 2 horizontal and 2 vertical constraints. To add a dimensional constraint, we use these tools over here. And it's always preferred to try to get a horizontal or vertical constraint before we try to do an aligned constraint. So let's create a horizontal constraint now. And we can either do it by selecting 2 vertices or by clicking on a line. So now we have a pop-up that says the length. I'm going to specify 3 meters and I'll give it a name. Let's call this width. Okay, I'll double click on this and I'll give it also a name that says length. When the sketch appears green, that means that it's fully constrained, meaning that we cannot change anything. And we can see that in the solver messages. By the way, you may have a nasty grid on. If you do, in the edit controls, this is enabled by default. If you uncheck it, it goes away. You can also change the size, maybe to something more akin to architectural scale, like 1 meter, in case you want to. Right, now that we have the sketch fully constrained, I will exit out of it. And with the sketch selected, we can see the constraints. And let's change the length to 6 meters. We need to refresh. If I press F5 or Control R or Command R, depending on what machine you are. And now we have an update. So what can we do with that sketch? If we go to BIM, with the sketch selected, I'll create a slab. And you see now that the sketch went away. It's actually underneath of slab, and we're starting to build a tree here. That means that slab 001 is dependent on this sketch, which is called 008. However, we can select the sketch again. Now it's hidden. If you press the space bar, it becomes visible again. And now let's click the wall tool. So now we've also created a wall. Let's click F5. For some reason my wall is not working. Sometimes that happens when the elements are not completely connected, but they are. Let's try again. I'm going to delete this wall. Select the sketch again. I'm going to zoom because I sort of lost it. Fit the selected document on the screen. Oh, it's hidden, so it's hard to do that when it's hidden. Here it is. Let's try the wall command again. Okay, now it works. So let's enable the slab as well. Okay, so now we have a very simple wall and slab, but they're all both dependent on the same sketch. So if I select the sketch, and you see within the tree that it's both under slab 001 and wall 001. That means that they're dependent on it. So now if I click on the sketch, change the width to 8 or 7. Hit F5 or refresh. And we see both the slab and the wall updating. Now that's very similar to the way that Revit, you can imagine we can build the same thing. We start with a sketch for the floor, and then we constrain the walls to that wall, to the floor rather, to the lines on the floor. But in here they're actually based on the exact same sketch. So it's a little bit more like families creation, but outside of the family creation environment in Revit. Okay, so this is the simple example. Let's go now to the more complicated one. I'm going to turn these guys off, enable my array, and let's check out the tree for this array. So if I select it, we can see, and let me turn it off, I have a floor. And the floor is made of a slab and a wall. Within the wall, I've also put some windows and a door. And there's some interesting things happening here. I think it's when I moved the size of the door and the wall, these windows used to be there, but now they're there. Anyways, so let's see how this is constructed. Oh, and the sketch. This is what the sketch looks like. So we have a width again and a length, and there are 2 radii, and then an inner offset. And if I change this, let's change it to 15. This is how it looks. If I change the height to 9, that's how it looks. I think this constraint is too close, so let's put something larger, like 12. This is, if you use Revit and Revit families especially, you're pretty aware of this workflow. And let's see how we can build it in Revit. By the way, all of this now just updated itself. That's the update. Okay. I'll turn this floor off and the slab. Let's get started. So I'm going to change from BIM to Sketcher. Now, it's important to note that there is also a sketch button here, and that depends on the current working plane. But sometimes it's enabled by Auto, so you might not be realizing that you're drawing on a kind of a weird working plane. That's why I prefer to go to Sketcher and create a working plane from here and my sketch. But feel free to work in any way that you like to. Okay, so I'll start with a polyline. Put the middle point and notice how there's a little dot next to the polyline tool, which means that we're gonna automatically get a coincident constraint. I'm gonna go horizontal and notice how we get a horizontal constraint. I'm gonna go vertical, and if you're kind of close to vertical, it knows that there's some tolerance of the angle. It automatically makes a vertical constraint. And I'm gonna make an angle, and you see now we have this what is it called? Fix a point on an object. So kind of like tangency, I guess. So I'll put this here and then connect these guys. And if you escape twice, you actually exit out of the sketch. Just double click on it to get back into it. So that's the initial element. Now let's fix some radii. When I saw this for the first time, that's when I got really excited, because fixing a radius like that and being able to manipulate, if you know, in Rhino, it's quite difficult. We have to rebuild it or build it in Grasshopper or something like that. Okay, so I'll create a new radius here. Let's check these lines. Okay, so we have now the geometry. Now I'm going to start adding some dimensional constraints. First, let's add this constraint. Let's call it length. The actual units, the actual length doesn't matter because we can change that later. So I'll say this is length. Okay. Let's add a width constraint. I'll make this 1 meter as well. Width. And let's add a radius constraint. .4, and I'll call it radius. Now in Freecad, everything could be related to anything else. So if I click on this constraint here, I can start pressing equals and I get the formula editor. And if I start typing constraints, it lists all the constraints that this object has. And you can see before I start typing constraints, for example, I have an object called chamfer. If I click on it and then dot, let's say placement, and it gives me all the values that I can actually use from a different object. In this case, I want constraints radius. Okay, so these two radii are sharing the exact same radius. Now let's change this to 4 meters just to see what happens. Okay, so we can still move this point around. Now I'm going to create an angle between this line and this horizontal axis. Let's leave it at 25, and I'm going to call this constraint angle. And now you see the whole sketch is green, which means it's fully constrained. Let's see what happens. We're going to do the same thing that we did before. I'll click on BIM, select the object, create a slab. I think my object is a little bit small, so I'll click on it, change the constraints. Let's make this 14 meters by 8 meters. And the radius probably wants to be 2 meters. Let's see what we get. It's a little bit better. Now let's add a wall. So we're doing the exact same thing that we just did, except with this new object. Okay. The nice thing is that now we can continue to edit the sketch, and both the wall and the slab will respond. So let's just put something like this. And you see there's a wall now on that side, but the slab hasn't updated. There's some settings within the slab. So if I click on it, you see it gets selected in the tree. And if we expand the properties, we have a series of possible series of properties. So addition, axis, base. What we want to go is to structure, face maker. There's one that's called cheese, and it makes a hole in the slab like you have holes in Swiss cheese. Cool, so now we have this kind of sketch set up. Now the only thing is I didn't constrain that initial angle, so if I change some of these constraints, let's make this 45 meters. Yeah, you see this doesn't have any relationship to the larger element. Let's make it 12 meters. And now we have a kind of a weird intersection. It's still computing, otherwise we get a little X if there's an error. But we're not getting the hole anymore. So I'm going to go back inside the sketch by double clicking. So instead of just moving these guys around, let's add some more constraints. I'm going to select the vertical constraint between these 2 points. And I'll call this 3 meters offset. I'm going to create now a horizontal constraint between this point and this point equals constraints offset. And now we have this orange color, which is a reference constraint. Let's do the same on this side. Equals constraints offset. And for this guy, let's make him parallel. So I'm going to get rid of this constraint by clicking on it. Now you see we can move this point. And if we select both segments, let's add a parallel constraint. So now they'll always stay parallel. And let's create an aligned dimension now. I'm going to first click this vertex and then this line. And equals constraints offset. And I want this to be a little bit different. So I want it to be related to that, but let's say it's a little bit smaller. So constraint offsets times 0.9. So this is 3 meters, and that's 90% of 3 meters, 2.7 meters. Cool. Once again, the sketch is fully constrained. So if we exit out, we have something like this. Let's play a little bit. Let's make it 23 meters. And the height should be 8 meters. So let's hit refresh. The wall is not computing. Sometimes you have to manually mark things to recompute. So if I right click, mark for recompute, refresh again. Sometimes they just don't work. Let's Let's try it again then. So with the sketch selected, let's create a wall. What that usually means is that there could be an error in my sketch. So it's not the walls issue, it's something in my sketch. Typically there may be an open segment somewhere, or an overlapping geometry, like I've drawn a line twice. So for ease of use, I'm going to erase one of these lines. Let's just make sure that all these are constrained. I'm just pressing C. C is the shortcut for coincident constraints. Now let's create a new segment. Whoops. So now it looks like it's the same, but I didn't get that dot initially. So let's try again. Click on the segment. Here you go. I'm getting the little dot. Here you go. Now let's make this guy vertical. Let's see if that works. There you go. Now it works better. Yeah, so sometimes there's some issues, but usually they're not bugs, even though there's definitely some bugs in Freecad as well. But it's the way that some geometry is built, especially with sketches. There could be like a little gap or some weird constraints or very short segments or things like that that you need to check out. So let's adjust some parameters again. Let's make the offset something larger, like 6 meters. 5. And again, this wall is not really happy with that. Oh, I see why. Because there's probably an intersection there. Let's make this 5 meters. There you go. So you can see how, actually this is demonstrating something very good. Topology is really important in the sense that, you know, if we have overlapping vertices like we had when I offset this a little bit more, then Freecad doesn't really know what to do with that geometry. So the first thing to check when you have an error is just go through and make sure that everything in your sketches makes sense. Great, so now we've created the sketch, and I'm just going to place randomly some walls and windows. So in BIM, if I click this icon here, that's a window object. So it randomly makes them, and that's because I don't have a wall selected. So let's first select the wall and then try it, and now it's hosted on that wall. And here we have a little window that in which we can specify the width and the height. Let's make these 1.6 meters tall. Oh, by default, if I just leave 1.6, and this is definitely a bug, it leaves it in millimeters, so you have to just specify meters in this case. Here you go. I think we can copy and paste them now. Let's see, if I select this element, the window, select copy. Let's see. I lost my frame. Not sure where it went. Yeah, so that's why I prefer, instead of doing this, we can create a clone. So this little sheep, I think it's a cheeky reference most likely to that sheep that got cloned, I don't know, 10 years ago. Alright, I'll just close out of that. So now we have a little clone. I wonder if this is hosted. Clone of base. No. So if we have a window or other hosted elements outside of their host, like for example, if I see this window here, it tells us, what does it tell us? It tells us where the host is. And that window doesn't have a host. So if I click on here, it's kind of hidden, but there's a sort of a selector menu. So if we select it and then find, if I start typing wall, and I can see this is called wall 002. Feel free to rename your elements also if you want with F2. let's call this external wall. Alright, so now that window, which is a clone, and you can tell it's a clone by the little icon there, is on the exact same place. So if I click on him, and in placement, I adjust the position. So I'm just going to move the Y a little bit. And now we have a new window. I'm just going to clone this a couple of times. Or we can array it. So let's create an array. So with the array we have a couple of options. So we can array either, we can do a radial, a polar array, or rectilinear. And then we have some values here. So if I go in X, let's adjust this to something like 2 meters. And then change the number to a few more. Get rid of that. Actually, I'm not sure whether array would work with Windows because there's no way to host them. Let's see. Yeah, so I'll get rid of this array. I think we just need to, whoops, just get rid of the array. We need to copy and paste these items around. So I'll copy this again. Okay, so now we have 3 windows. You can add more or anything, but just for demonstration purposes, we leave them as they are. Okay, so within Freecad, we have all kinds of different objects, and each of them has an IFC tag. So if I look at external wall, for example, and scroll down, we see IFC row, and those can be adjusted. What's wonderful about this system is that any element could be any other element. For example, this wall doesn't really need to be wall. If we want to, we can make it, let's see, a window if we want. And if you import this into a different program with IFC specifications, it will come up as a window. For now, I'll keep this as a wall. So similarly, we can create all kinds of different elements to sort of group these. So one of the useful tools is the floor object. So I'm going to click on it, and it creates a new floor, which in itself is also an object with an IFC row building story. I think these are sort of like default industry standards. So if I select slab and external wall, put them inside a floor, and now they're part of this. So the idea is that we can move the floor and all those objects will move with it. In order to be able to do that, we need to make sure that with the element selected, there's a property that says move with host. And by default it's false, so let's set it to true. So now if I move my floor around, I'll go to placement position, and let's drag this a little bit by X, and you see sort of everything moves with the base. There is an option in edit preferences in Arc, in defaults, rather here in general settings, set move with host property. So if we enable that, when you draw architectural elements, that property will always be true. I'll leave mine for true. So with this element, now let's do an array. Select the floor. Create an array object. And for some reason, it kind of creates new colors. Need to report that as a bug. let's say we have something like that. Okay, so now again with this one, I know it will work. If you go to, oh yeah, by the way, we have view and we have data. So in the view, we have elements that we can adjust, like colors, like how the way that these appear, transparency, and then data is location, hosts, everything that has to do with the geometry. So with the array, interval x. So I just want to look at one thing over here. So in array, in floor, in external wall, I want to look at the actual name of that element. So even though it's labeled external wall, the internal name is always shown down here. So if I select it, even if I hover it, you can sort of see it there. But now that it's selected, I know that it's wall.002. Now that's important because what I want to do is make sure that the array matches the height of the wall. So in interval, I'm going to change the interval z. So in interval z, for the z value, I'm going to click equals. Then I'll start typing wall 002. And then dot height. So that automatically gets the height from this wall, and we're going to use that for the offset value in the z direction. And now let's change the number of z elements. I'm going to make sure the x and the y are 1, and z, let's put 5 stories. So with 5 stories on, F5 to refresh, and now we sort of have some initial massing. So let's play with it a little bit. And here, by the way, we have the whole tree. So we know the array is based on the floor. We know the floor is, we know that the floor has a slab and external wall. We know that the slab is built with a sketch. And we know the external wall is built with a sketch, and then it also contains windows. So now if I adjust the sketch, let's change the length to 17 meters, offset, it still works, but I'll make it something smaller, 3 meters. And let's change the angle to 18 degrees. So now I just need to click refresh. So edit, refresh. And we see the whole mass got updated. Now, what if I want to change something of the initial floor? Well, we can do that because it's in here, external wall. So let's say that I want to subtract something out of it. I'm going to create a new sketch. I'm going to go to Sketcher, create a new sketch, XY plane. And it doesn't matter. I usually like to keep my sketches close to their origin point. So something like this. Let's make it a little bit larger. And then I'm going to build geometry based on that sketch. So with the sketch selected, I'm going to go to the part workbench. And I'll click this icon here, which extrudes the sketch. And then we have a window. And I'm going to say 10, let's say 2.5 meters. Okay. Now I want to chamfer this edge. So with that edge selected, I'm going to click chamfer. It has the edge pre-selected, and I just need to specify a value. 1.5 meters. Okay, so now that's chamfered. Let's move it to position. You can either, let's see, does it work? No, you can either move it in BIM like this. Oh, by the way, in move and copy are actually the same command. And there's an option that's copy. If I uncheck that, then it should move freely. Okay, but I want to show you another way to move around. So with this object selected, in placement, position, if I click on one of these and just scroll up and down, it moves up nicely by a meter. I find actually this way to be a little bit more precise. So let me just put this close to the building. There you go. So now what I want to do is subtract this hole from this wall. So if I click on this wall, which is still this external wall over here. Actually, if I click on here, we see it selects the array. So I need to hide the array for the time being. Show the wall. Again, we toggle hide and show with the space bar. And now let me select the external wall. And in here we have an option called subtractions. So I want to just make sure I know the name of this object. So it's called chamfer 001. So then I'm going to click the subtractions. And I'm going to select chamfer 001. Now let's select F5. And now we have a gap. So if we go back to the array and hide this wall, and we see that that gap is now array taller than because we subtracted it from one of the original elements. So within the external wall, we see now we also have the chamfer as part of the tree. So if I select that chamfer, and I double click on it to edit, and let's change that angle to something smaller, like 0.25 meters. Click OK. And you see all the elements updated themselves. And if I go back to chamfer and adjust the initial sketch to say something longer, close out of it. And now we see it's also made a hole from that wall because it goes through it. So this is the power of parametric sketching. Let's go now to this sketch over here. Adjust some parameters again. Let's make this a little bit smaller. So that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully this gets you a little bit more familiar with the tools. I just want to also let you know that I've started a Patreon. And in case you're not familiar with it, that's sort of like a platform where you can support me so I can do more videos and create even more interesting tutorials. So if you find value in this, please consider supporting me on Patreon, and I've included the link below. Thank you, and see you next time. And if you have some suggestions for what kind of videos you want to see for Freecad or how you want to explore it, I'm very open to suggestions. Thanks again.